Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kevin Tan, and I'm going to be the moderator for this afternoon. Welcome to Living with Myths, part 7 or number 7 in the series of I don't know how many. But before we start, I'd like to ask Kaseng, one of the key conveners of Living with Myths, to tell you a little bit about Living with Myths. I know some of you have been here 7 times already, or have been at 7 occasions already. But even so, Kaseng, can you tell us something about Living with Myths?
Thank you, Kevin. I didn't prepare for this, so this is going to be very impromptu. So basically, the Myths has been running, the Myths series has been running for about 7-8 months now, and we have been looking at various aspects of the myths of Singapore as a nation. So these are national myths, and these have got to do mainly with myths about history and society in Singapore. Most of the previous talks have focused on Singapore history in some way, and sometimes they have focused on other themes like multiracialism. And we hope to do more with these non-historical, but just as important myths in Singapore history in the future seminars to come. So very glad for those of you who have come today. I think the series is important, especially in the context today, as G50 is going on, and the myths that have existed before are being reproduced and replicated so much more this year and even last year and possibly in the year to come as well. So those of you who have seen Days of Rage and Days of Disasters will know the kind of myths that we think should be questioned and should be scrutinized today by scholars, by academics and public intellectuals. So I'm not going to say much more. Most of the stuff I think are going to be said today by the 3 speakers. But we hope that you have a treat today worthy of Valentine's Day. Right? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kaseng. And now we have 3 very interesting talks for today. The title, as you can probably imagine, has more than a shadow of Foucault behind it, which is discipline and prescribe rather than punish. But I think that's part and parcel of the prescription part of it. We have 3 talks, rather different in character, and I suppose what we'll try to do, I hope I can do, is try and tie them all up in some kind of a common theme. The first one, we have with us Christine Han, who is now teaching at University College in London. She's going to be talking about the myth of Singaporeanness, values and identity in citizenship education. Her talk will then be followed by Soh Lang. Teo Soh Lang will be talking about political lawyers, development and clampdown of the law society in the 1980s. And then right at the end, Chua Beng Huat will be talking about the banning of a film, which is Tan Pin Pin's To Singapore with Love. Before we start, I should just make a couple of administrative announcements. Number one, I think we are very privileged to be able to be in this space here. This is the gallery belonging to Beng Huat's here. Great, Beng Huat, your seat is here. Gallery belonging to Mr. Teo Seng, a well-known local artist and cultural medallion winner, and of course Soh Lang's brother as well. And so on that account, there are very valuable artworks around here. So I know we get carried away, but don't lean on them or because, well, unless you plan to buy them, then I'm quite sure we can facilitate that. The drinks are in the corner up in the front on my left, which would be your right, and the washroom is just behind the screen on the right hand side. Okay, so Christine, all yours.
Thanks for coming on Valentine's Day. I assume you're either with a date or dateless, so that. I'm a huge fan of work of people like Kaseng and all the young scholars, so I was really pleased to be invited to come. When I was told 2 weeks ago that Chua Beng Huat is speaking and Teo Soh Lungtraces is speaking, I thought, wow, I must go and listen to this. Then I realized that I have to actually give a talk as well. So, okay. So I will take the perspective of education, yeah, and I'll talk you through the kind of the myth of Singaporeanness that the government has promoted using education. Oh, I'm blocking. Is this better? Okay. Right. Um, I'm going to talk about the assumption I'm making is that a nation is a group of people, right? A group of people with some shared culture or myths, stories, history, or understanding. And if you take the understanding of a nation, Singapore wasn't a nation at the time of independence. It wasn't. We weren't meant to be Singapore. We were meant to be Malaysia, right? So I suppose at that time the government had to construct this view that we are Singaporeans. Um, and different people have called this different things, myth making or creating a collective memory or even invention and fabrication. That sounds a bit cynical, right? A bit negative, It's like it's all fake, right? So I kind of prefer Anderson's terms of imagining and creating. But just for a shorthand, I will use the term myth for what is produced in terms of the kind of concept or story that we are as Singaporeans, and myth making for the process, but without any negative connotations. And I'll be looking at the school curriculum, looking at the values, looking at the historical narrative, which goes into this myth of being a Singaporean. I will take you through a quick potted history of the history of citizenship education in Singapore, and depending on when you're not, I'll know how old you are. Uh, Broadly speaking, I'm using citizenship education as all the things that schools do to prepare young people to become citizens of the future. And in Singapore, in various times, various places, it's taken on different aspects. It's taken on moral education, it's taken on civics, it's taken on national education, history as well. So I'm using the term citizenship education as a broad grouping to include all these things. And I will show you that it includes moral values and it also includes this narrative, this historical narrative. At independence, I don't know how many of you were around there, then it was ethics, right? So it's all about good values, the values you should have, right? Being polite, being humble, and all that kind of thing. And it was all about being a good person. Within 2 years of independence, the ethics was changed to civics, and then that was when things like patriotism, loyalty was brought in. You could see immediately that within very soon after independence, the attempt was made to get people to become loyal to Singapore, and a sense of responsibility towards the community as well. By the 70s, there was education for living, and this included history and geography. So you could see how this myth of Singaporeanness was expanded, not only certain values to do with the self, to do being patriotic to the country, but also to do with history, right? How we came to be. I remember vaguely all these stories about Paramiswara and all that kind of thing. Sana Utama, perhaps I misremember in those days. That shows you how old I am. But also the idea of the place, the land we were on, being part of this story of who we are. By the end of the 90s, there was this, it was a stock taking time. The 1670s is often called the period of quantitative expansion, the having to meet the education needs of Singapore of those days. And then there was a stock taking around the late 90s, and they were worried about whether all this was effective, all this what was taught was relevant. Should children know about Singapore Constitution? Was it too deep? And was it too didactic and ineffective? It was all going in, So there's a huge stock taking, which I'll talk about a bit about later. And then we had Being and Becoming, which is a moral education program. And I think it tried to take a new stance. So instead of so much telling children what to think, it used things like helping, given a moral issue, they would help a child to look at the different possible options, to consider all the options, to make a decision, and to commit to a decision. So this is often associated with a person called RAS. There's a values clarification approach. It's not to tell you what to believe so much as to help you clarify what you really believe. There was a brief experimentation with religious knowledge, but this was withdrawn after a few years. You may be aware, right? A few of you are nodding, because it was deemed to be too sensitive, too easy to proselytize, cause racial disharmony and so on. So that was removed. In the 90s, everything was consolidated in civic and moral education. There's Hao Gong Ming, good citizens in primary school, civic and moral education in secondary. And then there were two new major initiatives, national education and last year, character education. And these are the two big ones in recent decades. You may have heard all this. If any of you have children, you would have heard all this, right? The national education messages, right? Singapore is a homeland, it's where we belong, racial and religious harmony, meritocracy and incorruptibility, no one owes Singapore a living, we must defend Singapore, we must have confidence in our future. And these have become the non-negotiable type messages that every child must carry with them. And the other thing is that it is also, as we have gone on, the values have been more and more, in a way, comprehensive. It's not only in the moral education or civics education subject, it's also in English, in second language, in geography, history. I'll talk about history a bit later on. Anything where you can fit this, even in science or mathematics. And it also broadened out into, sorry about this, cross-curricular subjects, co-curricular activities, learning journeys, and you may know some of this, right? Racial harmony, day, total defense, and so on. So it was kind of across the curriculum, infused throughout, and also across longitudinally, so it was reiterated and repeated across the years you're in school. What you can't see there, maybe we suspect something's conspiracy, is the reason why the picture is there is because one of the things that became highly emphasized is the Singapore story, especially in history. And of course, the Singapore story is the title of a book by a former prime minister, and scholars have talked about the very strong, dominant narrative, very coherent or similar to or consistent with that of political leaders that you find, this narrative that you find in school. So the latest one is core values, respect and so on, integrity, care, you have citizenship competencies. But the new thing is social and emotional competence, right? Self-awareness and so on. And the two things that jump out at me when I see this is resilience and also courage, So the idea is that you care about your friends and what's happening around you. You have the courage to do the right thing. You have the resilience to persist through difficulties and so on. So those are the sort of potted history of what you get in citizenship education in the last 50 years. In the 90s, late 90s, when I mentioned, when there was a stock taking of how citizenship education should be gone about, there was this report by Go Keng Swee, and the preface was written by Lee Kuan Yew, and he says this: "The best of East and West must be blended to advantage in the Singaporean. Confucianist ethics, Malay traditions, Hindu ethos must be combined with skeptical methods in open discussion. We have to discard obscurantism and superstitious beliefs, and as we have to reject the passing facts of the West." And this is clearly an attempt to construct something, right? So it's an unabashed statement to say that we have to dismantle what we have, to reconstruct this in a way that suits our purpose. And the purpose in Singapore is always survival, social stability, harmony, and progress and so on. So it's unabashedly instrumentalist and also pragmatic. So, just to summarize, therefore, there's a construction of Singapore identity, and you have all these values that are quite comprehensive, actually. Your personal traits, being hardworking and diligent, self-discipline, your personal moral values, like integrity and honor. There are values pertaining to the social, filial piety and so on, to the community, civic consciousness, and to the country, patriotism and so on. So it's quite wide-ranging. What I want to comment is that these are substantive values. They basically tell people this is what you must believe and this is what you must have to be a good person. Okay? This contrasts with the approach in Western societies, which is on procedural values. In the West, they tend not to tell you what to believe and what to think. They tend to emphasize the values that govern interaction. So rather than say, to be a good boy or girl, you must be this, they say, all right, we may disagree, therefore, in interacting with another, you should respect each other, you should have tolerance, you should respect difference. But Singapore, as in more so actually than many East Asian countries, very substantive, a very clear idea of what you should believe in, also quite prescriptive. And also everything harnessed towards the national messages, the national project. I'll have a quick look at history education and the work that Katira Kamsi and I have done. The portrayal of Japanese occupation since the 80s, right? And this has been brought back in and I suppose given more space and emphasis. You can see that the Japanese are, you can see the picture over there, shooting people and so on in trenches. They're cruel and brutal, and therefore the Japanese other, defines itself as if they're cruel and brutal, we are innocent and good and so on. The Japanese are very clever and committed, the bicycling thing, right? They're very clever. And therefore, by definition, Singaporeans, if we want to defeat possible enemies, we must also be clever and even more committed, right? The Japanese are depicted as being incompetent, selfish in administration, and by implication, we should have our own just way of doing things, right? We should appreciate good government and so on. I remember being very young and learning about Lim Bo Seng and his memorial, But now there's a concerted effort to emphasize that there are heroes from other societies, that there was a very united, effort among people of different races, ethnicity in response to the Japanese. So, clearly, the national education message, we must uphold meritocracy, and so on. And if there's anything about collaboration, it's because the Japanese are coercive, and therefore, we can't help it almost. So that is a clear example of how history, for example, is being used to promote a certain historical narrative, certain values, and particularly to illustrate and reinforce the national education messages, including meritocracy and multiracialism. I will quickly summarize what I've just said. And when I talked to Casting earlier on, he said, "Oh, but what's your alternative?" So I've added a few slides on alternatives, okay? So, in summary, the scope and vision of national identity and what being Singaporean has expanded, right? So there's been a sort of a listing of the values you should have, the qualities you should have, the right conduct, patriotism, national education messages. And in recent years, it has gone back to the character. And to me, that seems to be quite intrusive, because more intrusive than before, because it's not just the values you have, it's your very character. And there's also been a historical narrative with selecting certain things, it seems to me, in order to emphasize certain messages. So what are my comments? I think I've said this as an elaboration of national myth. It's comprehensive across the curriculum, across the school years. Yes, and in most other places, there is generally a distinction between a civic identity and an ethnocultural identity. And in Singapore, it can't be ethnocultural because there are different ethnicities, so it's civic, right? But the civic identity or nationalism in other countries is often seen in terms of political or civic institutions, right? Like, freedom of the press, civil society, individual freedoms, and so on, okay? But here, there is very little of that. Instead, it is a set of values, right, constructed by the political elite, and harness the national project, civil society, I'm not sure if we are even allowed to talk about in school, because it could be quite suspect. So let's just take a breather and think, right? So that is what it is like. It has been like up to now, and it is like up at the moment. So what are the alternatives? I'd like to see preparation for social, civic, political participation in a plural society in a more meaningful way. Recently, I don't know if you're aware, but last year there was a group of Taiwanese students who occupied the part of the Taiwan parliament. And there was a thread in one of the hardware zone, right? I suppose mainly male, young male demographic. And I was just sort of watching their reaction. And they were saying things like this. At first they said, what, the Xiao Mei Mei, the young girls, not bad, not bad. And then they said, wow, like that, how to get job in bank afterwards, And then after that, it was like, and as the occupation wore on, it was like, this is very bad for the economy, They don't know it's very bad for the economy. They'll lose their jobs and so on. So it's a very pragmatic, very economic thing, which I suppose maybe the MOE might be happy about because maybe all this has been successful. But the question is, if you really want to care about people and so on, maybe it's got to be something beyond the economic and the pragmatic. It's got to be something more. And the question is, what civic space is there? I mean, I'm not sure, as I said, we could even talk about civil society in this country, because I remember George Yeo was trying to find a different word, and he was saying civic society, because civil society gives you option of maybe political meddling or something, I don't know. So but is there a space for this in this country, and what are the consequences of such involvement? At the same time, the other point I want to make is that just because if there isn't any social disharmony because of those out of bound markers, it doesn't mean there is social harmony. It just means it's not being expressed. It's just being a lid being put on it. So I'd like to see maybe procedural values, the respect for others and so on, respect for tolerance for difference and other points of view, so that there's more individual autonomy and self-regulation rather than having imposed from the outside. I'd like to see a more nuanced approach to pluralism. There's a very strange understanding of multiculturalism in this society, actually. I mean, when I've talked to young people in school, and they tell me things like, multiculturalism in Singapore is Indian, Malay, Chinese, and other. And only Singapore have, you all in England don't have this kind of thing. And I was like, I live in London. Have you seen how diverse it is? But it's a very strange idea of multiculturalism as just four races and, this sort of particular harmony that we have here. But really, we have to think more in terms of not only ethnic and religious diversity, but also values, orientation, and so on, and respect for this. And I think so far there isn't that sort of more nuanced understanding of a plural society. The other thing I'd like to see more of is a more genuine and nuanced approach to democracy. To meritocracy. The problem, well, of course, it is a good idea in principle, right? You'd rather have the principle of meritocracy than nepotism, right? I mean, it's obvious. But the way it's done here, it's a bit worrying sometimes. I mean, I remember teaching PGD. These are graduates who do a 1-year teacher training course before they go to school. And I just could not get them to understand the meaning of cultural capital. Could not understand. Just could not. I mean, they were like, the idea is that if you have cultural capital at home, right, the parents are graduates, they have lots of books at home, bring to museums, or on plays and theatre. You have an advantage in terms of your cultural capital. And, but the training teachers just couldn't understand it. And they would say to me, no, but my father was poor and then I got scholarship. So if people don't make it, then they're lazy lah. And in fact, 2 days ago, I was walking on the street and two children were behind me, and they were about 11 or 12, and the girl was very depressed. And the girl said, 我不会读. I don't know how to study, I'm quite stupid in other words. And the boy said, 不是不会读,是你懒得读. It's not because you're stupid, but because you're lazy. So there are only two options, right? Either you're stupid or you're lazy. No possibility there could be your home background, that you're slightly disadvantaged and so on. So there's self-blame, and there's also blaming the other, and a lack of compassion sometimes, I think, for people who may be less advantaged than less lucky than we are in terms of our background. And therefore, if it's their fault, if it's your fault for not doing well in school, and therefore your fault you can't get a good job, therefore why should I just care about social disparity, right? You deserve it. You are either stupid or lazy, and therefore, you know, you're there because you deserve to be there. And so why should I make the effort to fight for, more social equality and so on? And finally, the idea of being Singaporean and a more genuine Singaporeanness, common culture, needs to be developed through spaces, right? Public spaces and so on. And I'm afraid our mainstream media, it's just the last few days, it's just been pages and pages of Ang Mo Kio, Hougang, and I really wonder, how significant this for ordinary Singaporeans, rich and poor around Singapore, and it doesn't reflect. It is not a forum, a space where people can, and so people take it to social media and so on, academic discussions, and I suppose the social media is a possible space, but then you have to be careful as well, right? Given the recent incidents and so on. All right, so I'll stop here for the moment, and maybe we can leave the rest for discussion later on. Thank you.
No, it's okay. Okay, we're gonna move the thing back so that some of you can actually come in front and sit. If you, yeah, okay, because our next two speakers have told me they don't need PowerPoints to enthrall you. Okay. Yeah, so there's a little bit more space now, so some of you can come. Sorry about the squeeze. Yeah, Siseng, what's that? Down here, one seat. There is one in the corner here. Yeah, someone can take that seat in the corner. No? Oh, that's yours. Oh, okay, hang on. Sorry, that's taken. Okay. Yep. All right. So from the construction of citizenship, we move on now to talk about the construction of politics and what is permissible and impermissible in terms of what professionals, Singaporean professionals in Singapore, might think it's their duty to talk about. And for that, we have Teo Soh Lung, who will be talking about political lawyers and what happened in 1986. And I must say that that in fact was the first time I actually came across Soh Lung as a person. It used to be primetime TV, especially the select committee hearings on the Legal Profession Act. They don't do these things these days. Airing select committee hearings on TV, and it was at that time, believe it or not, okay, pre-internet and so on, primetime TV, we actually rush home to watch the encounters between various members of the legal profession and, of course, our politicians. But let me not spoil the party. So long, all yours.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for the introduction. 1986 was the most memorable year for me in my entire 30-odd years of legal practice. And the years leading to 1986 were the most meaningful years for me as a lawyer, because there was so much to do in the law society. And by the 1986, the end of 1986, everything ended. And that also ended myself. Well, what exactly was the law society doing during all those years before 1986 that deserved the wrath of the PAP government? In October 1986, during the Select Committee hearing, I give you this quote. It's from Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. He said, "It's my job as the Prime Minister in charge of the government of Singapore to put a stop to politicking in professional bodies. If you want to politic, come out." He was really talking like a true gangster. That was said during the select committee hearing, and everybody was silent. So, that was said in October. So what exactly was the Law Society doing the years before 1986? And that's why, this is the subject of my speech today. I was a player during those years, and so I cannot be too objective. But I will just narrate to you what happened during those years. There's also one point I would like to say is that a book just recently came out, and that's the priest in Geylang by Arut Serena. I read the book, and I was completely, in fact, a little shocked that what was happening to the Law Society in 1986 was also happening in the Geylang Catholic Center, and they were also being interrupted by or disturbed by the government, and that was what the Law Society also suffered during those years. So, coming back to the Law Society, first of all, I want to tell you that there are actually three basic statutory duties of the Law Society. I will not summarize for you, but I will just read the three duties. One, to assist the government and the courts in all matters affecting legislation and the administration and practice of the law in Singapore. Two, to protect and assist the public in Singapore in all matters touching or ancillary or incidental to the law. And three, to examine and if it thinks fit, to report upon current or proposed legislation and any other legal matters. These three duties are very unique to the Law Society. No other professional bodies have these. So what is the Law Society supposed to do? They're supposed to look after the interests of the government, the courts, and the people. And because of that, I think, Lee Kuan Yew said that we were politicking in 1986. So let me get back to what I was going to tell you. What was the Law Society doing during all those years in the 80s? The first duty is to scrutinize bills and to make recommendations to the Attorney General's chambers, which I believe the society did faithfully for years, but they have never made public what their views were during those years. And so the public doesn't know what the Law Society was doing. And during the 1980s, actually there were some changes in the legal profession. There were more young lawyers because there were more graduates from the local university. Young people were more interested in the law, so they produced more lawyers to the market. And the admission of all these young lawyers, and I was one of them, we were quite different from those lawyers that were senior to us who came from London, qualified from London, and we were more interested in the local situation. So during those early years in the 1980s, a group of young lawyers together with a group of academics came together, and we discussed what was happening in the courts. And one of the law lecturer came to the conclusion that the poor people had a disadvantage when they go to court without legal counsel. And so he presented a paper, and we actually studied it, and we came to the conclusion that it was the Law Society's duty, or rather the government's duty, to provide criminal legal aid. And so we actually wrote to the government to implement Part 2 of the Criminal Legal Aid and Advice Act, which deals with criminal matters. But the government said, no, we are not going to provide free legal aid for criminal matters. Then we said that, well, if they are not going to provide that, we will look into the possibility of setting up a criminal legal aid scheme. And that was exactly what we tried to get the Law Society interested. And that scheme came about in 1985. And so that was a scheme for members of the public, right? Now, also in the 1980s, there were a number of laws that were passed through. Like today, laws are passed very easily because it is almost a one-party government. There was one particular law, and it's called it's the amendment in 1984 to the Penal Code, which provides for minimum sentencing for various offences, as well as change the law for investigation from 24 hours to 48 hours. And when the law was passed, this bunch of young lawyers in the bar room suddenly realized that what did the Law Society do? And then, of course, we don't know what they did. So this bunch of young lawyers then called an extraordinary general meeting to request the government to repeal that law. And so actually 62 members of the Law Society petitioned to ask the government, 61 lawyers, asked the government to withdraw this bill. The resolution was passed, and it was the first extraordinary general meeting of the Law Society in 18 years, according to Harry Elias. Then in the 80s, you will remember that J. in 19 came into, was elected in the constituency of Anson. And then in 1984, another MP came about, that's Chiam Si Tung. So there are two lawyers in parliament. I think the government woke up that lawyers are pretty troublesome. And I believe they were paying attention as to what lawyers were doing during those times. And during those times, the practice of law for young lawyers was also very difficult. In the bar room, you could hear lawyers complaining that the judges were unreasonable, especially the subordinate court judges. They were unreasonable. When lawyers are sick, they ask for to stand down the case, to postpone the case, and they were asked to produce medical certificates. And they felt that this has never happened before. Why are they doing this to lawyers nowadays? And so there was a lot of unhappiness in the bar room. And 85 came along, and then suddenly Francis Xiao was standing for election into the council. It was really terrific time for lawyers. It was so exciting, and it was not what the government say that it was only the young lawyers who were pushing Francis to stand for election. The older lawyers were the ones who wanted him to be elected. And he won the election by overwhelming majority, 223 votes out of 332 senior lawyers. He was actually 43 votes ahead of the second best candidate. So he was popular, and naturally he was elected the president. At the opening of the legal year in 86, he gave a speech in the High Court. Were you there, Kevin?
No, I read it many times.
This was held in the Court of Appeal, and the court was packed. And he said in court that he will stand up for the lawyers, right? He will not let lawyers down. That lawyers will be respected. His speech was beautifully given, and at the end of his speech, the lawyers applauded. It was, I think, the Chief Justice was very unhappy. So the next day, the press actually dubbed him the new champion of the bar. Yes, he was the new champion. A lot of young lawyers as well as old lawyers were looking forward to what he would do. And he did a few things which got himself into trouble and which also got the lawyers into trouble. But if I were to jump a few months later, it was all planned. It was not because of anything. It was because Lee Kuan Yew saw that Francis Xiao was coming up and he was going to put him down. And I can read to you what he said at the select committee to convince you if you need to be convinced. Now, what did Francis Xiao do during those years? The first, 1986, he became the president. J.B. Jeyaretnam was undergoing a lot of trouble. He was contempt. He was in parliament. He was hauled up by Dana Balan for committing some privilege abuse, breach of privilege.
Failure to disclose pecuniary interest.
Yeah. And then I think he was also charged for defamation and a whole lot of things. He was in big trouble. And then there was the transfer. He was charged, of course, in the criminal court for breach of trust before the first district judge, Mr. Michael Koo. And he was acquitted of several charges. The senior district judge, yeah, Michael Koo. And he was acquitted of several charges, although convicted of one, I think. And shortly after, he was transferred from the bench to the Attorney General's chambers. The gossip among lawyers was that he made unpopular decisions. And J.B. Jeyaretnam raised this. I don't know how he raised it in Parliament. He was, the Parliament was very angry with him, and they called a commission of inquiry. And there was a fourth term of reference, which is if there was any interference in the judiciary, i.e. the transfer of one judge to the Attorney General, then there need to be a study on the entire judicial and civil and legal service and the judicial service, how they run these two systems. And Francis Xiao actually formed the committee to look into this. The fourth term of reference. And we did, the Law Society did the report on the independence of the our Singapore judiciary, comparing it to Commonwealth countries. But that report was never presented to the government simply because the commission found that Jeyaretnam's allegations were all not substantiated. But somehow the Lee Kuan Yew knew about this report. And the lawyers in the select committee were grilled on this, including myself. Then the second thing that came up was the Newspaper and Printing Presses Amendment Bill, 1986. A committee was also appointed to look into this and make a report. They did. They presented this report to the Attorney General, and the Attorney General didn't even acknowledge receipt, probably threw it away. And then, having put in so much hard work, the Law Society then came up with the idea of issuing a press release. And so that was done. And then the government was angry and amended the Legal Profession Amendment Bill to exclude lawyers from commenting on the laws. So there was, as Kevin said, there was a parliamentary select committee in 1986 in which the lawyers were grilled. And then at the select committee hearing, let me just read to you what I promised to read to you. What Lee Kuan Yew said. He said to Mr. Xiao, Francis, at the hearing, Mr. Xiao, when we legislated it never occurred to us for one moment, first, that lawyers of more than 12 years standing would vote you into council, and second, that council members, 10 of them, would vote and make you president. And when that happens, the law will be changed, because obviously the lawyers are not fit to look after their own affairs. By the time they elected you as president, I am entitled to tell members of parliament and Singaporeans that they are unfit to govern themselves, a right of government which we as legislators have delegated. That is why we are here, to change the law. And if you convince me further that we have not changed it adequately, I will go another step and make sure that this does not happen ever again. It is for me, it is not for you to decide. And taking the cue from Mr. Lee, Eddie Barker also reinforced that view and said, we chop and change the law as and when we like, We go to select committee, we hear views. It is not your view, it is not your bill, it is not the bar's bill, it is our bill. It is our bill, but you said we sneaked in and we made no reference. There you are. Those are the references. So we can chop and change the law as and when we like. And that was what the Law Society suffered. But that said, the lawyers actually didn't die lying down. I was nominated to stand for election in the council of the next term, 1987. And the lawyers voted me in with quite an overwhelming majority, just 4 votes behind a very senior lawyer. So they stood up for freedom of speech. Right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Soh Lung. There is really a lot more behind this. Yeah, sorry? Yeah. Yes. So you want some of these people to move up there so that those can sit in front, is it? Yeah, maybe those in the passageway, maybe you can migrate up the stairs. Alright? If I trouble you, because otherwise nobody else can come in. Yeah. Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, so maybe you can come. Yeah. The stairs can take a bit more. Yeah. Are you going to admit some more, Sui?
Ask them to come 15 minutes later.
All right. But I don't think you're going to get any less crowded though. Okay. Well, anyway, I was just saying just now that actually it's unfortunate. I think we should get Soh Lung in to do a much longer talk because that whole episode was really quite fascinating for many of us and quite chilling, in fact. I remember in NUS we used to have videos of the entire select committee hearing. I'm still trying to find a copy. I can't find copies now. But they will used to be a VHS video, and I used to make my students go and watch it every year. And then after a while, those tapes also disappeared. So, but if you wanted to see what Lee Kuan Yew was like when he had his nails and claws into you, and of course the riposte from Francis Xiao really upset him by constantly referring to him as my dear Prime Minister. And at one point, Lee Kuan Yew actually said, "Will you stop those terms of endearment?" But anyway, enough drama for now. The drama really is in the drama that you're not going to get to see publicly, which is Tan Beng Huat's film. And for that, Beng Huat's going to talk about the banning of film. Beng Huat.
I don't have anything to say, actually, about Tan Beng Huat's film. Okay, let me just. I should come clean that I was one of the 2 people, along with Beng Huat, to put up the film for censorship clearance. Ahmad Masadi at the NUS Art Museum and myself, on behalf of the Asia Research Institute, had actually and Beng Huat put up the film for clearance because we were going to organize a 2-day film retrospective on Pimpin's film, and we wanted to.
They can't hear you.
Oh,
Yeah.
we wanted to add the latest film to it, and at that time it wasn't yet sort of cleared, so we had to put it up. So after about a couple of months, we didn't hear anything. So once you didn't hear anything for 2 months, you are supposed to voluntarily understand that you should withdraw the film. Being who I am, I wasn't going to do that. I had decided that we are going to get the government to show its hand of censorship if it was going to ban the film. So we stuck to it until finally we heard that it wasn't going to happen. And also so the rest of it, most of you would know already, because after that there was obviously a lot of publicity about the movie. And immediately after the announcement of the ban, some university students from NTU decided that they were going to, it was also said that it will be shown in a documentary festival in Johor Bahru, and of course immediately there was a big organization, the students organized themselves to go and watch the film, which in fact quite a lot did turn up. So if you ask me whether I've seen the film, yes, I have seen the film. I saw the film before we put it up for censorship clearance. But the content of the film, I think by now everybody knows. It's a documentary of 6 or 7 exiles. I've only seen it once, so I can't really quite recall all the details. Mostly some living in London, some living in Thai-Malaysia border. All of them, of course, expressed desires to come back to Singapore. And there wasn't, I think if you don't know the history of these people, you won't be particularly enlightened about their history, because actually there was very little said about why Tan Hua Piao is in Britain and so on. The communists, the interesting thing is that the communists don't hide the fact that they were communists. They were quite open about it. They show photographs of themselves in the jungle. So it's not as if they think they have something to hide. So the film was mainly about their current position, their current sentiments, rather than about their past. And my real puzzle, really, so to me, it wasn't really something that, because the government really doesn't have to give, it did eventually give some reasons, largely is to say these people who were communists, and they actually didn't, the fact, the sort of labeling everybody communist, it's a bit strange, because the ones who were exiled in the 1970s were not clear what their political affiliations really were. It still remains unclear to me unless I go and read up on them. But the reasons was eventually made clear to us that it was banned because these were communists who refused to come back and be interviewed. I'm still puzzled by what does being interviewed means. It was said that if they will come back and be interviewed, and then they clear up the past, and then they can be rehabilitated, so to speak, which is the example they keep using about Cheong Sim Pi. What's his name? Yu Chui. Yeah, about Yu Chui and Sharma and this guy. So the to me, the sort of interview remains rather mysterious. And the rhetoric, of course, got worse and worse, because Lee Hsien Loong was saying that if we allow this film to be shown, we'll be sullying the people who died for the nation. We would sully the honor and the reputation of security forces, people who fought the communists to build the Singapore of today. And so then when Yaacob Ibrahim started to talk about this, he started to compare the by now 80-year-old ex-communist with contemporary jihadists, which is really stretching it a bit much, particularly considering it's a Muslim speaking. He should really have a bit more respect for his own religion than that, right? So it got to be quite extreme increasingly. But there is one line that actually caught me that I was kind of amused, really, more than anything else. Lee Hsien Loong said, "Communism is now over, but I don't think the people who used to support communism has given up their fight for a place on the winner's podium." That's an amazing statement, right? Because it shows you, it basically tells you about the PAP's conception of history more than anything else. So, as you know by now, the revisionist historian like us, the revisionist historian has got it all wrong. History is objective, not interpretive. History basically is, factual, and rather than the revisionist self-serving and blurring. There were communists, non-communists. There was violence on the one side, sacrifice on the other. It's kind of interesting to see who were the victim in a way, if you kind of think about it. There were losers and winners, of course. So the loser now want a place in the podium of the winners. There were terrorists, and of course there were victims. So then there were villains, and then there were good citizens. So there's a whole series of binaries that are being played out in a way that any undergraduate would have a great time doing texture analysis. But to me, what is the most puzzling is the context. What's most puzzling to me is, why did the government ban this film? Of course, everything will be speculative because the reasons that were given I was already told you about. To me, why the puzzle is interesting is because it's a very clumsy act. Okay, because banning of anything is a clumsy act. In some ways, that's why I refused to volunteer. We were told we were going to force the hands of the ministry by announcing the date of the event. And usually, if you do that, they will actually have to tell you an answer possibly 24 hours before the event takes place. So you would have booked the venue, did your publicity and all, then you have to cancel, right? This has happened before to theater groups. So we were going to say, okay, let's put up flyers, all right, and see what happens. We were then advised not to do this, all right? By whom I shan't tell you. We will basically say, well, don't do that, wait until the decision is made. We thought it might be censored on political grounds, but here's really what's interesting. It wasn't. Because that there is a film review committee, a political film review committee. We thought it would be sent there. It was sent there. We found out that it was sent there, but the political film review committee refused to make any judgment because it isn't within the purview of the committee to decide, because the committee has very specific guidelines that they were supposed to only deal with films that that concerns political party activities. All right, so so they decided, they turned the film back to the censorship board, which meant that obviously it had to go somewhere else. We don't know, but my sense is that the ban actually came from the Ministry of Home Affairs. And probably the minister himself made the decision. Okay. So then the question is, so why this clumsiness? And the reason why I say it's a very clumsy act is because, in fact, banning a film is politically very costly, because it shows the repressiveness of the state, that it precisely would do everything it can to avoid, or it ought to. Right? So I have great respect for the government in terms of intelligence. I don't mean that facetiously, I mean that seriously. Okay, this is an extremely intelligent government. I have done different things. I mean, I know why I say that, and so for me, what is interesting is, why does an intelligent government does such a clumsy thing? By showing itself to be this, it's been all this time trying to be less and less mean, and I mean that seriously too. If you look at the government, I mean, like what Soh Lan was saying, chances of that being repeated, it's not very high. Partly because the political conditions of the world is over, it's way post-Cold War. 87 was already very late to talk about Marxist conspiracy. 2014 has absolutely no room to talk about Marxist conspiracy, okay? And in terms of legal aid, the government itself is doing a lot of so-called legal aid clinics, and the Law Society is doing pro bono work. So we need to understand that our political condition has changed a lot, and the government has been trying to become more and more liberal, for want of a better word. They were never liberal, but I don't mind that. I think there's good reason not to be liberal. But at the same time, so given its attempt to continuously humanize itself, this was then a very clumsy act. It's clumsy because it shows its hand. Secondly, it's clumsy in a particularly interesting way. It's not a film that will get the whole nation to the theater. It's a film that only very select people would watch it. It's for those who are not interested in history, for those who are into blockbusters. It's a very boring film, right? So so the audience for those films are very particular, and ironically, that is the audience that in some ways the PAP going forward need to convince to vote for them, because this audience probably already has about 50% knee-jerk reaction against the PAP already. So to then anger them unnecessarily is to just shoot themselves in the foot. So to me, that is really quite interestingly clumsy. So the question is, as I say, given such an intelligent government, why do something so clumsy? And I think, again, I mean, we really don't have any answers, so we can only interpret events. I think part of the problem is that we are actually heading towards increasingly an ideological vacuum. I think that in Singapore right now, all the words that you could use to so-called unite the people is withering away. In the last attempt was in Goh Chok Tong's days, when Goh Chok Tong first came into power. He did two things that was interesting. One was to change the language of politics from representation politics to trusteeship. So now you hear a lot about we are the trustee of the people. And the second thing was, he was consciously looking for a new ideology, which is what we now known as shared values. That, of course, never got very far. In fact, it's not clear where the shared values is. It never was clear because the white paper was tabled in the parliament. It was never made a law. It was never made a charter. It wasn't like a Declaration Bill of Rights. It's simply there, okay? To do what is still very unclear to me. All the attempts to develop, new ideological terms have failed. National security continues to be used, but again, that's weakening. I think the sort of terrorism, so-called Muslim terrorism, may have one last kick at national security. It's not that they are not issues, it's just the issue you can't galvanize people to, because it just doesn't, So, and nationalism also is a problem precisely because we become, in some ways, badly more nationalist. We are having all these sort of mildly xenophobic reactions against foreigners. Singapore has always lived with foreigners. Suddenly now, in the last few years, you get this sort of diatribe against foreigners increasingly, right? So if you want to play the nationalism card, your foreign labor policy becomes highly problematic. So in a way, my sense is that there really is no more terms left currently until something else comes up. For other ideological term to be made, to have the kind of ability to generate what the government keep calling the social compact between the government and the people, it's going to be progressively difficult because people have become more and more sort of individualized in their liberal values. So in a way, then you look at this very statement by Lee Hsien Loong about communism is dead everywhere in the world, but ironically, communism is alive in Singapore. The communism is alive in Singapore because it is actually the final term that has to be kept alive in order for the PAP to have a founding reason to exist, beyond the tears of anguish, right? So I think that at this point, interpretively, that's probably the best one could come up with, was to say that, in a certain sense, the grounding of the nation, the very historical grounding of the nation, has always been problematic. We don't have a founding myth. We have the shot of Lee Kuan Yew's tears. That's the founding moment, right? But we really have no founding myth. The reason for our being, it's still very unclear. I mean, one way we did it was to say we got kicked out of Malaysia. We like to play the victim. That has some cachet in terms of how we deal with Malaysia. But beyond that, there isn't a lot. So my sense is that communism will be alive and will stay in Singapore for a long time. And there will be, just think, okay, monuments will be erected. There will be a plaque in the esplanade to remind Singaporeans of those who have died gloriously for our nation, killed by communists. Although it's unclear that those people who got killed were Singaporeans, because in those times, Singapore and Malaya wasn't exactly two countries, right? So that's my speculation about why the government was being so clumsy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beng Huat. I'm going to now invite all the speakers to come up to the front so that you can have a good view in all of them. And we are happy to now, open the floor to the audience for questions and comments to what was said. As I said at the beginning, so long? Yeah. As I said at the very beginning, this is today's series of talks actually straddles several areas, and I think eventually you can begin to see some of the trends take place. I mean, Christine started off by talking about this idea of citizenship, what it means to be a Singapore citizen. What is it that the state requires citizens to become, this whole nation-building exercise? I wrote a paper not so long ago where I basically argued that we've spent 50 years building a state and not a nation. and of course there's a legal paper looking at how laws have been centralized, powers have been centralized rather than facilitative in making a nation. So what is it that we are trying to do in creating this nation, this citizenry, and what do you want these citizens to do, right? So once you create these citizens, presumably citizenship comes with certain rights, and this is very clear. In the Constitution, we do make a distinction between citizens and non-citizens. So if you're looking at freedom of speech, for example, under Article 14, it only applies to citizens and not to non-citizens, right? So what is it then that this privilege of being a citizen entail? Do we expect them to participate? Does citizenship include participation in the same way that the law society, the lawyers in the law society thought that it is their duty as citizens, as lawyer citizens, to actually do something about it? And of course, what does it mean in relation to fighting for a particular nation that you're thinking about? And this is where I hope we can bring in something about Pin Pin's film. I know the substance was not about the film, but really about the clumsiness of the PAP in this particular exercise. But hopefully that sort of ties up some of the disparate thoughts that have been floating around. So maybe with that, I'd like to throw the floor open and take questions or comments. So please stand up and tell us who you are, and then maybe with your question or comment. Anyone? The first one always problematic, right? Yeah. No, Soh Lung wants to run home. She wants us to end the session. You better ask a question, okay? Yes.
I wanted to take this. But I do have two questions for Soh Lung. The first is, the state tries to draw a division between what it says is politicking and the activities of the law society. Do you think that division is valid? And number two, a slightly more naive question, do we have an independent judiciary?
To your second question, if I say
It's on.
it's on,
It's on.
if I say it's not, then it is contempt of God, right?
Yes.
But you can use a metaphor.
So it's very hard for me to answer your second question. I think each of you ask yourself. Make your own judgment. The first question, whether the law society was politicking. Well, it's one of the duties of a statutory duty of the law society to comment on legislation. And if I backtrack to the 80s, I don't think that was politicking. Clearly, we were just doing something that the law society had always
It's on.
had
Quite loud. Yeah.
had always been doing. The only difference in the 1980s is that under Francis Xiao, he issued a press statement, and that was never done before. In the past, the Law Society had, looked at the bills, made comments, reported to the Attorney General's chambers. The Attorney General chambers, I don't know how often they will agree to the views of the Law Society or not, I do not know. But in the 80s, when this newspaper bill came up, they did not even acknowledge receipt, probably because of what Mr. Lee had already in mind, that the lawyers need not be respected, and therefore you can just throw the report into the bin. Now, to cast light on that report, actually a bunch of young lawyers, including myself, spent a lot of time researching into that law and making that report. If you spend a lot of time and then people just ignore it and throw it into the bin, I think you will not be very happy. But it was not the young lawyers who instigated the Law Society to issue a press statement. They themselves issued the press statement. And it was not the president of the Law Society who issued the statement. It was the entire council of the Law Society who issued the press statement. But Francis Yao paid the price. And that was it. Yeah. So if you ask me whether they were politicking, I would say no, but to the government it's politicking because you're commenting in public. And in fact, there was a lot of debate on this. Chan Heng-chi herself said that it's right for the Law Society to comment on laws in public. There's nothing wrong. However, a lot of ministers objected to that. And it became a national debate, no? In the newspaper. If you look at the past issues of the papers, a lot of debate on that. One-legged chicken, two-legged chicken, that's, I heard, was Rajaratnam.
Rajaratnam.
Yeah. So
What's that about the chicken?
one-legged chicken and two-legged chicken, and maybe got three-legged also, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
It was a pseudonym used in an article, right, that was written in a particular way, so much so that we all were absolutely sure it was S. Rajaratnam who wrote it.
And mind you, that debate was not about what the Law Society press release was all about. It was whether the Law Society had the right to comment on a law in public. I mean, you look at the Bar Council in Malaysia and elsewhere, it's their duty to comment publicly on the laws. But they were not happy.
Beng Huat, you want to say something?
Yeah, I think in the question that you asked about independence of the law, right?
Or the
Judiciary. But this is it's a kind of tricky question in some ways, okay? Depends on what you assume in mind. Because there's a very high tendency to think that the judiciary should have the right to review all laws that the government passes. But in fact, that's a very American tradition. And it's a very exceptional tradition.
Yes.
It is. The automatic judicial review is an American tradition. The Canadian adopted a Charter of Rights that is actually equivalent to the Bill of Rights, which also gives the Canadian judiciary to judge against the law if it wants to. Recently it actually had made a decision about assistance visa, right? But what I'm going to tell you is what the Chief Justice would say to you. What the Chief Justice would say is that in Singapore, all right, and he will insist that this is the British tradition. That's debatable. But in Singapore, this is what he would say: the Parliament is supreme in the law making.
No, you're wrong.
No, that's what Chan Sek-Keong said, okay, publicly, all right?
He did not.
Yes, he did. In the Singapore perspective, he said that. Okay, and then the interesting thing to say is that he says that the court's only duty is to carry out the law equitably, but not to be activist in changing the law. He says that the court has no rights to do that in the Singapore system. He also says, if you look at the law very closely, thank goodness Lee Kuan Yew was a lawyer, his value is all over the law. Okay? What did he say otherwise? That's how I heard it, that's what I hear him say.
Okay, I wasn't at Perspectives, but I am a constitutional lawyer.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to make this about me, but I just want to make a very quick clarification. Number one, it is not absolutely true that Parliament is supreme. Chan Sek-Keong has said it many times. In particular, there was an article which he published. It was called "From Angst to Empathy: Judicial Review in Singapore." And in that article, he actually made it very clear that in Singapore, it is a constitutional supremacy. Okay? And that all laws that are made by Parliament are subject to judicial review.
Yeah.
Now, I think this is where all laws are subject to judicial review. It's very clear. Article 4, Article 93 makes it very, very clear that all laws are subject to judicial review. Problem, of course, is that our courts have never ever pronounced any law to be unconstitutional. There was once, 1998, the case of Toh Cheng Kong, the public prosecutor, in the High Court, where Justice Kartikesu actually declared Section 37 of the Prevention of Corruption Act as being unconstitutional because it violated the equality provisions. However, when it went to the Court of Appeal, it got reversed. So therefore, the record still stands that we have never ever declared law to be unconstitutional. But there's nothing wrong with declaring it unconstitutional. The difference, I think, in the sense of the American sentiment or spirit of interpretation versus the sort of the more Westminster British system is that we do give Parliament a lot of deference. Okay? In other words, if Parliament tells us that this is the object of the Act, then I must take it as it is. And I'm quite sure many of you have been following the 377A debates. And the court, in the Court of Appeal, the judgment said that no less than 6 times, we are not the mini legislature.
Yeah.
We don't make the law.
Right.
Okay, now this is where the court is very concerned, never to overstep the boundary
Of the law.
between the separation of powers, in other words, between the judiciary and the executive and the legislature. And the reason is very simple, because judges are not elected. And if you are not elected, you cannot make the law. So for a long time, judges pretended they never made the law. They only declared the law. Okay? They only, if you stare hard enough at it, you get the answer, but you don't make the law. It's a legal fiction. It's a legal fiction because, they are not elected, right? This is called the counter-majoritarian difficulty. So that's not realistic as an interpretation. But maybe I can try to answer that question you posed to Soh Lung without getting into contempt problems. I think if you look at independence of the judiciary, what do you mean by independence? If you mean independence in the sense that does anybody call up the judge and say, hey, hello, you know what to do, huh? If you're looking at that kind, I'm very sure that none of that happens. Okay, it does not happen. Okay? But you see, as Beng Huat rightly pointed out, the government is very, very clever, and so is the judiciary. So clever people don't do these kinds of things, right? Now, if you appoint judges that are cut of the same cloth, people who share your world outlook, people who share your view about internal security, now there's nothing wrong with that. There's really nothing wrong with that. That happens all over the world, right? In fact, America becomes so political that they want to know, especially if you were a law professor before, what kind of articles you wrote. So nowadays, the joke in America is you want to be Supreme Court judge, don't write anything, right? Because everyone is just going to Google scholar you and, this guy pro-abortion, anti-abortion, whatever the case may be, right? Now, the appointment of judges is something that I don't think one can quarrel about, okay? So if you're thinking about interference, and that's why coming back to Soh Lung's point, she did say that JBJ did make the allegation that there was executive interference in the case of Michael Khoo's transfer, and they did an investigation. And the result of the investigation, which people tend to forget because people got so upset with the whole thing, is that they found no interference because his transfer had been actuated by the sole decision of the Chief Justice himself. Okay? In other words, the Chief did it. I didn't ask him to do it. He just did it. So then that begs the question, right? If you is independence, do you not have independence if you're second guessing what you hope, what the powers that be might want? Now again, do you know that he's second guessing, or he really felt Michael Khoo stepped out of the line? I mean, there are so many possible interpretations. So I think this judicial independence thing is a very tricky thing, and of course, the other problem is all those defamation cases, and everyone says, "Oh, come on," But the reality is, if you actually look at the defamation law, we are still kind of stuck in 19th century Britain. The test that applies to whether somebody is defamed comes from a 1932 case in Great Britain. It's still good law. Sorry. So there you are. Okay. Next question. Yeah.
I just want to talk about Peng Peng's firm. Could it be that the government see that film as a medium is a very powerful one? And if you look at the case of Martin See's Lim Hock Siew and Said Zahari's film being banned, but not the books. There's so much more books coming out, but they never ban books because they know that people don't read books. The non-converted one more so they won't read, so they don't see it as dangerous. But when it comes to the film medium, they think that, wow, this whole gang come together, watch, and then discuss. They may be slowly converting these people. I don't know.
Lee Hsien Loong said that very clearly, okay, in his comment.
So
That films are not like books. Books, they can counter-write a book. But films, you could obviously say you can make a counter film, but he didn't say that, right? I mean,
but a boring film to them is still powerful, as you see.
Thank you. Next comment, question. Yes, please.
I'm just wondering if the whole idea of myth and the creation of national myths and stuff. I'm just wondering if you think, because I think all states are engaged in this, right? Obviously, right? They're all engaged in this. But I'm just thinking, to the extent that maybe they overthink it, and maybe they over-problematize it. And I'm thinking about like my own perspective, right? I deal with a lot of Singaporeans in my classes back home. And those Singaporeans come from all kinds of backgrounds from in Singapore, so they're Malay, they're ethnic Malay, Chinese, Indian, and so on. They seem to group pretty well as Singaporeans. So in the same way that I tend to be as unnationalistic as you could possibly be when I'm in Australia. If I happen to be in Singapore and the Straits Times publishes an article that's critical of something in Australia, I suddenly become very defensive of Australia, right? So I'm just wondering if you think there's any sort of, or to what extent they kind of over-problematize, overthink this, idea about identity and so on. The whole world is kind of multicultural these days. In Australia, we dropped the term. Conservatives didn't like the term, so Howard dropped it a few years back. But it hasn't changed the reality. So I'm just wondering.
No, I mean, in a certain sense, this, either you flip, it's a kind of quarrel among ourselves, really. It has nothing to do with that. Nobody really cares whether this happens or not, right?
Yeah.
Only we care.
Yeah.
All right? So, so it's not really about national identity to the outsiders. It's about who owns history in a certain sense. Right?
Yes.
So instead of thinking of history as winners and losers, you can think of history as co-production. I mean, it's very clear. If there were no communists, the PAP would not know how to define itself since the 1960s. It's very simple. Because the PAP actually is a very left-wing was a very left-wing party in the 1950s, right?
Absolutely.
If you look closely at a lot of the public policies, it's still very socialist. Now, most people don't see that, but I can, you have to wait for my book. I mean,
state ownership.
state capitalism, public housing, okay, public education, all right? So that's why I said earlier that I'm not completely, that the PAP is anti-liberal. It's okay. In some instances, I don't have any problem, right? So I think that the PAP really, it could actually talk about itself with reference to the communists in much more friendly ways. Because it is really a co-production. They will partly define one place where the left legacy is very, very important, but it's anti-corruption. Okay? If you look at what Lee Kuan Yew said, was that when they got into politics, they discovered this whole left-wing organizations that were very ascetic, very committed to the masses. Suddenly, Lee Kuan Yew's name is no longer Harry Lee. The English word got dropped, they stopped smoking in public, they stopped drinking beer in public, they wear white. I mean, so the whole anti-corruption position, right, is this: if we're going to beat the left, we have to outdo them in all the moral high road dimensions. And they maintained this for a long time until the salary problem, essentially. Okay? So in fact, the whole history could be written in this kind of co-production mode rather than winner-loser mode. Right?
Yeah.
So all this is, of course, constructions that are highly discursive, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. I agree with you. I think young Singaporeans look at the playground; they're all playing together happily. There's no racial issue.
Well, I'm not saying there's never any issues, but I think that's everywhere.
Yeah, by and large, yeah. But if you look at the various things that are introduced, it's often in response to some kind of crisis. The national education messages were introduced because there was a survey and nobody knew who Winside Smith was, and people said that, if you fail, we'll just rejoin Malaysia again. shock horror, how can young people think that? So the messages are then banged in. And maybe there's something about, and if you lead young people, they will naturally come, around to their own little language, their own identity, the things they like and believe in, and so on. And you can actually see, if you talk to them, that there's a natural Singaporeanness going on. But maybe it is about control of the narrative. That perhaps, and part of this narrative is this state of crisis that you have to keep working, otherwise you stop being number one and everything fall apart. And so maybe it's controlling narrative is also something to try to get people to rally around and so on.
Well, that's part of it is the twice in Lee Kuan Yew is a really firm believer that geography is destiny. Okay, he said this to the Malays, he said this to the Chinese. He said this to the Nanda student. When Nanda was being built, he said that if Nanda was to become a shining, example of Chinese civilization supremacy, we're in trouble because we live in the Malay world. And he said geography is destiny. He said to the Malays about how not giving them guns because geography is destiny, right? So I think that as Singaporeans, we have to reckon with this. We don't have a choice, not whether we buy in or not. We are an incredibly small country. The idea of vulnerability will never go away. It doesn't matter who comes into power. The idea that you keep insisting that we're not Australia. Australia can survive under a lot more conditions than we can. So I think living in a small nation impose a lot of conditions that we refuse to think about. I think we will really be doing ourselves a disservice to continuously think as if we are a big country. Okay, so the question of control, not just in terms of history. History is an easy target to deconstruct. But much more seriously is the question of the economy, the question of security. No one actually has another answer. Okay. So I think I think we should think about that seriously and say, okay, given those conditions, what kind of polity can we have or should we have? And what kind of value should we seriously be thinking about? And not simply borrow all kinds of liberal values and kind of think that and use that as a critique of the present. You will not win a debate by continuously talking about rights, for example.
Okay, next, Andrew.
I'd like to ask Christine something. It's regarding national education. I recently had an illuminating conversation with someone from the Heritage Board, and it's something which he did mention. Using countries as models. I do remember in school being told that we should emulate, and in fact, to me, I often think it's cherry picking certain states. I was quite surprised when I came back to Singapore that when I looked at the textbooks, that Venice was chosen because when I studied Venice abroad, it's about an aristocratic cesspool of the decadence and sex, a lot of sex actually. And then I come here and it's so glowing, and so moral. Well, that shocked me. The morality of Venice, And anyway, the thing is about choosing. So I then spoke to my friend and I said, perhaps you could all employ me. I don't think they replied in the Heritage Board, and I said, I think that when you look at the 700-year exhibition in the basement, the whole chapter of the British Empire in Singapore, it's quite missing. So you have yes, the myths, and then you have Raffles, and then it's bang, the World War II. So I said, perhaps you can hire me to write about the wonderful British Empire in Singapore.
No.
Yeah, and then they said, oh, why would you do that?
No post-colonial society would do that.
Yes. So I said, they said, and I said, you think about it, because, they were saying, oh, like a lot of values, we try to use history to teach. And I said, one of the things about, when and he mentioned productivity, productivity. And I said, the British Empire in Singapore was very productive, because we don't need to emulate the Japanese, like you used that example. I said a few hundred British people controlled millions of Asians. That's a wonderful model to look at, to study.
What's your question?
Yeah. Oh, so what I want to say is, when we choose countries, in the past, do you think that will end? Yeah.
So that's directed at Beng Huat
Oh, to Christine in the syllabus. Like when we is that going to when we cherry pick aspects of countries, because we don't look at it in entirety.
I can't speak for the ministry. They do that. I mean, they sometimes use other examples to emulate, and very often, if they're uncomfortable with talking about interethnic conflict with Singapore, they'll point to somewhere else, and that is a way. It's always poor Sri Lanka, right? I mean, and that's a way to distance people from difficult questions and so on.
It's also a way of defining ourselves all the time, right? What it will not end. We define ourselves always by the other.
Yeah.
Whether we treat them as positive models or negative models, there's still others that we define ourselves against.
Well, but in this case, it's a little bit like a parent telling the child how fortunate he or she is.
Yes, we see.
Look at Beng Huat in the kampung day. You want to end up like him.
Ask Kazing about kampung day. I'm the wrong person to talk about kampung day.
Bukit Ho Swee, right? All right. Next question. Comment, please. No? Yes, please.
Yeah. I probably don't need the mic.
No, it's okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just picking up something that Christine's saying there. And my friend here is Australian. I've got to say, I disagree with your point.
Everything you say about Australia.
What do you do, right? But I've got to say, I'm not an academic. I have a very naive perspective on all this sort of things, so I'm just shooting this straight up. One of the things I've noticed since I've been in Singapore is the way people not necessarily define themselves, but certainly describe themselves in terms of the geography as destiny position. And I mentioned this, a businessman of no particular caliber the other day was saying that he's terribly worried about the new canals that are being built, the new ports in Indonesia, etc., because if Singapore loses that ability to monopolise the trade routes, and then, in his words, we lose our reason to be. And it occurred to me that I was wondering if, in replacing the sort of the communist threat as the sort of the reason being, if the POP is not moving towards saying, well, look, what we are is, yes, we're a small cog, but we're an absolutely intrinsically important cog of the whole neoliberalist mechanism in the world. We're absolutely central to trade. We must maintain this, and in a way that is an identification that's coming through now. I mean, when I talk to people about and using the positions of, say, for example, when you say describe yourself as the other, they talk about you wouldn't want to become Finland. So we're not socialists. Finland's socialist. We're not, and you would never want to be like that. So to me, it feels like, and I just want to get your perspective on that. Are they going to leapfrog now from the sort of communist narrative to the where?
No, we'll use all of them.
Okay.
I mean, why should we pick one or the other? We'll use all of them. The communist thing was good for history. The current contemporary situation of vulnerability is good for the present, right? I mean, so the line is we have to be relevant to the world, right? Because the world doesn't need Singapore.
Yeah. Siva.
Maybe mostly so long, but the rest. Do you think there's regret for the whole 86, 87 episode? But it can't be sort of acknowledged. They like to move on. They may share the sentiment that those of us who were watching felt, but hopefully everyone will forget about it. So that means they share the sentiment that it is unfortunate. Sort of a ghost of communist past that came out and created the whole episode. But they're not going to acknowledge it officially because that would be difficult.
You're asking regret on whose part? The government's part?
Yeah lah.
I don't think the government regretted what they did in 86, 87. I think the end justifies the means for the Singapore government, and I suppose for many governments as well. And they have succeeded in controlling, in putting down activism in that period. I mean, every period has its activism. So in the 80s, things were getting up, and they have managed to put it down. And then we start back zero again, and now it's coming up again, the activism. So I don't think the government regrets anything. It's political. Yeah.
You want to say something about it?
No, I don't. I mean, the government will take ideas from you and give you no credit. They will also do things even if they admit that in hindsight that it was a mistake, they will still not admit in public. It's not. It really is just political. I mean, not academic, technical things. I mean, not being a nice guy. It's just political.
Yes, I would add to that. I mean, look at the criminal legal aid scheme that a bunch of us started.
Yeah.
And now it's taken off in a state,
As a state initiative.
in a frenzy, and you know how many $1 million have been put in. I don't know. Yeah.
And they won't credit you for.
No.
So can I just ask a naive question? I've never understood when it happened at the time, and even now, what was the crime, you know? So your take is that there are these activism coming up, and therefore it has to be slapped down before they get out of control or something, and they decide if it's a personal challenge to me, therefore I don't like it. As simple as that.
Yes, it is. It is that simple. Because if you see the 80s, the 87 arrests, it's a whole range of people.
Yeah.
Yeah. And everybody was silenced for at least about a decade.
It's the Chinese proverb, right? You slaughter the chicken to frighten the monkey. Yeah. That's one of the possibilities. Yeah. But of course, the 1980s were also quite an interesting time because you see, if you begin to look also, I mean, if you start drawing a chart with the political trajectory on the one hand, activism on the other hand, and so on, I would say actually 81 Anderson plus 84 general elections, panic set in. It was a panic that bred paranoia.
It was also a time when Lee Kuan Yew was planning to give up prime ministership.
Was it?
Yeah. He gave up after. So his line was that the new cabinet had to be tested to see whether they had the guts to do such things.
But now they have lost, you know, a GRC, and they've lost, you know, Hougang. I mean, what's the?
Just saw yesterday's news.
I'm just wondering if there's still panic, is starting to panic, or if the environment is quite different.
2011, the panic was even more serious.
Yeah.
They're still in a state of panic. I think.
But that doesn't all go well for activists, right?
No.
That panicking.
Never did. Well, actually, it changed.
Right. Any other comments, questions? Yes, please.
Two questions. The first is for Christine and Huat, and that is where do you think citizenship education that doesn't have these themes that we've been talking about, like vulnerability, risk of racial riots, as well as the threat from communism. Perhaps you could call me brainwashed, but I can't see there being a different narrative of Singapore's history anymore. What do you think could be Singapore's history look like from a more positive angle? The second question is for Soh Lung, and that's with regards to the actions of the Law Society more recently, with regards to Amber releasing his psychological files back in 2009, and most recently this week, they brought him from practice until he can prove that he's in control of his psychological issues. And I wonder whether you'll be able to comment on what has changed in the Law Society's leadership, or what is different now with the Law Society today as opposed to the Law Society of the 1980s.
Let me ask Christine to take the question first.
Sorry,
So an alternative narrative, construction of Singapore's citizenship education. Yes.
That does not involve
Is it possible to construct an alternative to what we talked about? You know, I mean, you went through.
Yeah, it is so ingrained in us, right? People who have gone through the education
That's what
system.
he said, right? He said,
Yeah.
maybe brainwashing. That's why maybe
It's very hard to conceive of
we
something
can't
else.
see it something else, right?
I did a series of small interviews with members of the online citizens in conjunction with members of scholarism in Hong Kong. It's quite an interesting comparison, actually. And it was interesting that they actually had this mentoring going on, and they would write pieces. I mean, these people were looking at an example of the more seniors who were generally concerned about social issues and so on, foreign workers, whatever issues, and they would be inspired by that to be concerned about similar issues, and they would write pieces expressing their views. And what was interesting was that there was also a mentoring going on. There were lawyers, including NMP, right, who would sort of teach them the tightrope, you know, that if you keep on the right side of it, you'll be okay, but they're pushing the boundaries and so on. And I thought that was a very interesting idea of citizenship education that was totally different from what we do in school. In fact, if you ask them what we learned in school, they remembered nothing apart from holding little lady's hand across the road. You know, I didn't realize there's so many little old ladies in Singapore needing to cross the road, but it was far more authentic and far more politically useful, I think, because you need the skills, you know. But and they were exploring their own thing. So, but that's very small scale, you know, the kind of thing they were exploring in small groups and so on, mentoring. But the kind of thing you get, as I've said, the comprehensiveness you get in school and so on, it's just so overwhelming that, and at the same time, the narrative is aligned to the national narrative, the media as well. So it's quite hard. So even though I know that young people can be quite cynical and skeptical, sometimes you get things still get through. I mean, I do a master's here, and the first essay they write is all about we are a young country and a small country and there's no natural resources and and therefore all we have is our human resources, human capital, blah blah blah, and everybody writes the same story, right? So you think some of it has got through, even though young people are sophisticated now and skeptical and critical, some things still get through. So I don't know. I think small scale perhaps, but I'm not sure how.
Can I just respond to what Ms. Han just said?
Yeah.
I think sometimes the kids are smarter than what you think, because they think that the lecturers want them to parrot what they've been taught to get the top marks. I always get a response from my daughter, say that, "Mommy, do you want me to pass and get good grades, or do you want to be politically right? Which is which?"
Imagine that is in fact a choice.
Teach me. I'm not going to score to be politically correct, and fail me. What's the point? So I think sometimes you have to give them credit. So it's sometimes difficult to think that because they had brainwashed and therefore they parrot the same thing.
I think that
some things can be let off, some things cannot. I mean, the terms, part of the reason why this story is so powerful and so reinforcing is that you don't see what is unreal about it, right? I mean, it's a small country, it has no resource, all that is true. I usually say, even if, we are singularly cursed because we have no oil, right? I mean, Malaysia has oil, everybody around us have oil except us. But the interesting question is, even with oil, we can't dig it out because we have no place to live. Right? I mean, some things are destiny in that sense, right? So I think part of the story is not so much because it's fake or anything, because it is convincing, because a lot of it, the things that you cannot change, the smallness you cannot change, right? But working with it creates a lot of difficulties. For example, as I say, as much as Singapore wants to generate nationalism, it really is not able to say, let's kick out all the foreigners.
No.
Okay, so those are the kind of contradictions. I think the interesting thing is that we have the, I write a lot about Singapore for some things that, but I think you always have to keep in mind to a certain extent that we have the privilege not to act. And don't forget that, okay? I mean, it's critical, it's as critical as you want to be. You must always remember you have the privilege not to act. You are not the Minister of Education. If you are the Minister of Education, you have to ask yourself, would you have done otherwise? And if you really honestly can think otherwise, then you have something seriously critical to say. Then I think, you should say it in the most coherent and cogent way. But if all it is, why don't you put the bus stop somewhere else instead of in front of my house? That makes bad planning. Forget it. Right? Why is the columbarium going to be next door to me? It's got to go somewhere, right? So I think that, I think the way to deal with this kind of so-called, deep brainwashing, I mean, all school in the US, every morning you have to, say, you have to swear allegiance to the nation, right? So it's not exceptional, but there is a way of being critical, but the way of being critical is not to take cheap shots, but to seriously think, would I have done otherwise? I mean, using communism to ban the film is really unnecessary. That is not convincing. 1987 Marxist conspiracy was never convincing to anybody who thought, really seriously. In the end, the Straits Times even came out and said, we didn't believe what we were writing. Okay? So some things you cannot lie. People are not dumb. That's one thing the PAP really should think harder, is to give ordinary Singaporean more intelligence. Okay, they have very low estimate of ordinary people's rationality. That's why Lee Kuan Yew could say the things he says. I mean, interesting story about election that you were talking about, election of Francis Xiao, that it was a mistake, right? I mean, I hear that for the first time. That is Lee Kuan Yew's version, an early run of the idea of freak elections. Okay? People make decisions they didn't want to make. Give me a break. I mean, how would you know that? Right? So I think that the government really should respect the citizen a lot more. And I think that they are increasingly being forced to do that. They're not giving in easily, but now after 2011, I think they're increasing to do that grudgingly. But interesting, I think the 2011, we have to wait until the next election, because whether it's a watershed or not depends on whether the opposition gains next election. If the PAP want everything back, we are worse than before 2011. Okay. So, and the Workers' Party is not doing a great job, I must say.
Do you still want an answer to your question?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, I think in the 80s, politics has a lot to do with the awakening of the consciousness of people. J.B. Jeyaretnam, you remember, came in 1981, and it was live television telecast of the parliamentary debates. I remember sitting there and watching, wow, this is real debate. It's not a show. You know, before 81, I have attended parliamentary debates before, but they were like sleeping sessions. I've seen MPs putting their legs up behind the chairs and just snoozing away. But with JB in the parliament, it was a completely different kind of debate. And I think that that aroused the interest of the people. Yeah.
The live broadcast. The PAP made a mistake for live broadcast.
Yes, that definitely the PAP made a very big mistake for the live broadcast. In fact, the Law Society's select committee
was live
hearing. It was not live.
It was recorded. It was recorded. Yeah.
I think they recorded it for 2 days simply because I think they misjudged. They thought that they will win the debate. They thought Lee Kuan Yew will win the debate, but it was the lawyers who won the debate. So it was again a very big mistake on their part. How different is the Law Society today and the 80s? I think in the 80s it was just beginning to become active. To become concerned not only about legal matters within the profession, a kind of a livelihood kind of society where you only take care of your professional well-being. In fact, they never take care of the well-being of lawyers, unfortunately. They only know how to play golf. I was very frustrated because every newsletter from the Law Society was, tomorrow golf competition at country club, what day, what price. That was the kind of Law Society we have, and that was why this bunch of young lawyers and academics got excited about, this is not very good.
Point to yourself.
About the state of the Law Society and why they became more active and took a more active role in the Law Society, not only in the interest of the Law Society, but the interest of the public. The law that was amended in 86 was terrible. I mean, they prevented the Law Society from commenting on laws if they didn't submit them for comments.
It remains in force.
And it remains in force today. But I think the activism in the Law Society died when Francis left the scene, because I'm sure there are many ways to comment on legislation. It's just that they didn't want to comment. They just want to stay safe. They didn't want to antagonize the government. The council wants to please the government, and therefore, they remain silent over this issue. As for Ravi, I think he has been referred to the mental home, right?
No.
Yeah.
No, psychiatrist.
Psychiatrist.
To get clearance from a psychiatrist.
Yes, he has to make an application, right? I cannot comment on that because I don't know what is the state of his mental health. Sorry.
So now when you say the lawyers won the select committee debate, what do you mean by that?
If you watch the video, Francis Xiao calling my dear Prime Minister. And the dear Prime Minister was totally frustrated. He was so angry and his face was so red.
It's because he doesn't understand theatre.
He lost the debate. For instance, he debated with me over, this is a useless mic.
Yeah. Give it up.
Hello, test. Where's yours?
On and off.
Just turn it up.
This one very powerful. Yeah, he debated with me over the judicial system. What I meant by having an independent judiciary, how the judiciary was selected and all that. I think at that time, I remember, I didn't want to be rude to him, but he was totally ignorant of what was happening in jurisdiction outside Singapore. He didn't know what it was all about. And the issue of judicial review, if you read the Select Committee again, he was talking about judicial review that he studied when he was a law student in Cambridge soon after the war in the 1940s, where judicial review was not the norm. In the Liversidge case during the war, there was a dissenting judgment, Lord Atkin, and that judgment had resonated ever since the 40s, 50s. It came up, and in the 70s and 80s, it was very clear that judges have the right to review the decision of the minister. But he was still sticking on. Asking me, do you know what is the difference between a justiciable issue and a non-justiciable issue? Big words, but by non-justiciable means that in his mind, the judges cannot comment. You just have to follow strictly the law. Parliament. Yeah, Parliament is the maker of the law, and therefore you cannot comment on it. You cannot make decisions. You cannot take in factors that would confine the interpretation of the law, interpretation of the minister within the four walls of what is legislatively allowed. So his mind was set in the 40s. Yeah. And if you read the Select Committee, it's quite interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
You do have a copy of the deed?
No, but it's the book lah.
Yeah.
No. The only reason I asked Soh Lung whether she still has a copy of the videos of those 2 days. I mean, for those of us who watch, I really said, it was really like primetime TV. I can tell you a couple of other instances. One in particular stood up. If you remember when Tan Boon Teck, the Attorney General, was on the stand, and he was being questioned first by Lee Kuan Yew, and of course he said, all the right things. And then J.B. Jeyaretnam came on, and it was his turn to question him. And he said, well, Attorney General, do you not remember how we used to discuss this when we were students in London? And he said, oh, yeah, well, yes. Well, didn't you used to come to my home, all the time? And he said, well, yes, but not so often. Right? And JB just blurted out, he said, what do you mean not so often? You were the best man at my wedding. And there were many of these nuggets, right, throughout that 86. That's why I used to send students to watch it, but like I said, it's very hard. Now, of course, if you are able to extract a copy from SPH, I don't know how much it will cost you, but it's there, right? And I don't think it's been sent over to the National Archives either. We could try.
Yeah.
All right.
Actually, Francis Yao was very cool. After the debate, he asked the Prime Minister 2 or 3 times, Mr. Prime Minister, could we have the tape? And Prime Minister said, yes, you can have the tape. But guess what? After the Select Committee hearing, the Law Society was not given the tape. Instead, an invitation was sent after much reminding that we could watch it 2 days at Caldecott Hill for $10 each. Yeah. So we trotted up to Caldecott to watch it.
Right. Next. Any others? Well, if not, then maybe I could sort of round up by asking each of the speakers to maybe have some last words, whether, final thoughts or talking to each other's presentations. So may I start, perhaps? I'll start on the reverse. I'll ask Beng Huat to start.
Final comments.
I don't have anything else to it.
Nothing else? Soh Lung?
Just one short thing. I forgot just now to mention about the second extraordinary general meeting of the Law Society, which was attended by 1/3 of the bar. And it was a resolution condemning the amendment to the Legal Profession Bill. and it was passed by 404 out of 407 votes. So it was overwhelming, and of course, this again agitated the government, and that's why probably was one of the reasons why it was very angry. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Christian? You're all right. Okay, well, then it leaves me to thank our speakers. Please join me in thanking our speakers. And thank you, all of you, for joining us here on Valentine's Day, Living with MIVS number 7. There will be an 8th one coming up, so watch the space and, check the blogs and so on, and hope to see you again. Thank you.
Yeah, one last announcement. There are some books that are for sale behind, including The Priest in Geylang, which is a very good book, a very important book. Thank you.